The container is now open. Igor Kufayev brings just a massive amount of knowledge and information and lived experience to the topic of Kundalini. And maybe just the best place to begin is at the beginning with what really is, in simple terms, Kundalini.
Well, greetings. It's great to be with you guys, and I'm very honored and humbled. And thank you for introducing the book. So I will just maybe before we dive into this, go into the very term, and even before going into the very term, distinguish what do we actually mean by Kundalini when we say this today. Because this is where already the misunderstanding slips in. Because there are at least 3 different ways of how this term speaks to something which not always means the same depending on where and how it is used. So, there is a term Kundalini used today, we could say left, right, and center, which denotes and refers to some sort of psychophysiological symptomatology. We'll develop this further, hopefully in due course discussion. So in other words, it's the word that is being used indiscriminately with regard to these very, very varied processes that are, effectively speaking, manifest as the array of various different symptoms, all of them known together as psychophysiological symptoms. And there is the term Kundalini, as it has been used in Indian culture, in Indian lore, particularly since 15th century. And chiefly in its association with 2 principal texts, Hatha Yoga Pratipika and Shat Chakra Nirupana. Of course, we can go into the history of all that. Shat Chakra Nirupana was this text which was translated by so-called Arthur Avalon, that was his pen name, a mayor in India at the end of the 19th century, who was basically purportedly initiated into tantric rituals and was some considerable tantrika in his own right. He's the one who authored this book, known to this day as, it's on my shelf there, Serpent Power. So this was perhaps the very first book that spoke about Kundalini with regard to all the chakras, with regard to these awakening processes mapped out, which was then adopted into the curriculum of New Age in the following century, that is, in the 20th century. So these 2 principal texts gave that term a specific connotations, even already in India. And then there is the third provenance of how this term is used and where it comes from. And that is how Shaivites themselves use that term, coined that term out. And that's what the book tried to communicate. The attempt of this book is to restore Kundalini to its rightful place historically, etymologically, and scholarly, as well as to what this power truly represents. So if we cover this, if we've covered that, then we can then move on, and then with that distinction. So now one may ask, so what's the difference then? How is that being used today in, let's say, modern day spirituality out there, and how yogis used that circa 15th century, how it all came into the 20th century, vernacular of various different languages, and how that differs from the original, let's say, provenance of that term. So the main difference here is that somehow, for whatever it's worth, the term Kundalini begin to represent some kind of mystical power which dwells at the base of the spine in a particular location, somehow a property of a living human being, something within, deep within the esoteric, let's say, anatomy of a human being. So this is how the New Age adopted this understanding. And all the, even etymology has changed, undergone the change. So the Kundalini, for example, often if you open the Thesaurus, British, let's say, a dictionary of Britannica, like any dictionary, they will, if they will have the term Kundalini, it will most likely be translated as coiled. Kunda, coiled, right? There's more elaborate explanation, coiled 3.5 times, and at the base of the spine, in Muladhara chakra, so to speak, until it is awakened and begins its glorious ascent. However, the Shaivites understood this differently. The term Kundalini did not represent some power at the base of the at the base of the spine inside the human being, but the power of consciousness itself, which curves back onto itself, contracts to itself. So Kundalini, it's a very intricate science as far as the Shaiva teaching is concerned, particularly that what is known today popularly as Kashmir Shaivism. And this understanding operates with this symbology. So in other words, if we are to narrow it down, there is a Kundalini in terms of what it exemplifies, what it means symbolically, and then Kundalini as a process. So coming out of these distinctions, and of course we can go back to any of them, because in the New Age today, there's a complete and utter mess, a lot of misunderstanding. People have some movements, some experiences, some shifts in consciousness, some shifts in perception, some shaking, some sweating, some kind of psychological, let's say, strong psychological swings, moves, great internalization. Some people perform spontaneous yoga asanas, pranayamas. Some people do mudras, all spontaneously, involuntarily. Glossalia, vocalization, overtoning, humming, you name it, right? But all that does not mean that this is necessarily Kundalini process proper. And more importantly, it immediately ascribed and assigned to something happening to me, a person inside of my subtle anatomy. Sometimes people even think that it happens inside of the physical anatomy. That's as far as it goes in terms of the confusion. Whereas Kundalini, in terms of its proper understanding, in terms of its doctrinal understanding, and in terms of its esoteric dimension, it's nothing other than consciousness itself contracted to itself to such degree that it gives rise to this experience of being so and so. So therefore there is this already from get-going, we could say, a formidable link between that identity of being so and so, of which we can speak if there is a need, and consciousness as it vibrates, pulsates, within itself. So in other words, Kundalini was never understood from get-going as something inside human being, but the other way around. Human being is in consciousness. So human being in itself is a movement in consciousness, a frequency, vibration in consciousness. And of course, the beauty of this particular tradition, that it does not see this as an epiphenomena, or some kind of calamity, a mistake to be corrected, or some kind of error in creation. But it's a beautiful orchestration where consciousness undergoes this self-transformation for the sake of self-revelation. Because the human being here, as the tradition argues, is where the whole thing takes place. That's where the drama of creation takes place. So we can, of course, develop and speak more about that, but that's to the meaning of Kundalini. So therefore, the subtitle of the book is equally, if not more important. So it's the goddess as the power behind self-recognition in Tantric Śaivism. So it's the very power that Sanskrit term Shakti translates as power. So that power of self-recognition is that what is required to overcome the power of self-forgetfulness. So this is the true meaning of Kundalini. And so the etymology itself here is much more complex than just coiled 3.5 times at the base of the spine. In fact, in the book, there are sub-chapters where this is dealt with attentively to distinguish how throughout different times the place of the awakening itself has been considered not to be in the base of the spine. In the ancient times, certainly in the time when these teachings got to be formulated and became as the crème de la crème that India produced as a civilization. That's how Kashmir Shaivism is known to this day. The awakening took place in the heart. And this is how this was experienced here, if we are to use this immediately in terms of the first-hand experience. It was not awakened, it was not experienced as, let's say, very often one goes through these textbooks on yoga and so forth. So this is perhaps the entrance into the conversation. So when, let's say, people out there, us now speaking, someone else says the word Kundalini, it does not mean the same thing. And that's what poses this dilemma today, because people assume that everyone speaks of the same phenomena, of the same power. Because also there are people who speak about, yes, Kundalini is the power of consciousness, and now I'm awakened. This power is awakened in me. So in other words, Kundalini is now being reduced there and then to something that individual capitalizes on, you see, as a cherry on a cake, which is a totally and completely upside down teaching. It's a no-no. Yes, of course, any spiritual awakening, certainly when we speak about Kundalini awakening proper, before the process is fully gloriously completed, there are phases that are very, very uncertain and dangerous not just because they are dangerous per se, which we should speak in this conversation, even if we touch upon it, but dangerous also in terms of how in the earlier phases one can kind of usurp, capitalize this, and there will always be this attempts at claiming this power, which in itself, of course, is the whole point. One reclaims one's status. So, but it's not the individual, it's not the ego consciousness that reclaims it, but consciousness itself, which was always a driver from behind the scenes, now comes to the forefront. And that, of course, is speaking properly now, and from direct experience myself and clinically working with people for nearly 20 years now, I can tell how this can be a very challenging process, because there are these phases of complete and utter not knowing what one is, where one is, because as the whole subtle body begins to vibrate, and as there is this increased expansion of pranic forces, the prana begins to expand, right? That pneuma, that power that animates the body, that what animates everything here. And as it begins to move through the network of subtle pathways, all 72,000 of them, as tradition refers to, this, of course, is coincided and impossible without melting out of all the psychic impressions. And that phase can be so dramatic in some cases that a person is in a gaga land, totally not knowing where they are, whether they're coming or going, literally. It's a place of being in no one's land. One is not landed yet where this power of consciousness illumines and gives that sense, let's say, of inseparable subjective experience of that is, I am that. I am that awareness. But before that, let's say, becomes apparent, there are these phases, of course. And these phases can be very, very disturbing, uncomfortable, and in some cases, as I said, very dramatic. So if we don't speak about that, we will not give it a justice.
Yeah, that raises a question for me of the prana symptomology, or the psychophysiological symptoms that come with that vital life force. It doesn't necessarily then ultimately lead to the full Kundalini awakening of recognition of oneself in like complete unity, right? It doesn't necessarily mean if you're having these experiences that the ultimate, like, you're headed toward this ultimate place. So what is I guess, what do we do with those experiences?
Once we have established that Kundalini represents different things in different, let's say, conversations, right? It's not the same, let's say, power or the same entity or the same phenomena that we speak of, right? Yogis refer to Kundalini exclusively as something to get access to psychic powers. Let's not beat about the bush. This is known. This is recorded. So the Hatha Yoga path is literally taking the bull by the horn. It's that masculine Virya path of riding the hurricane, like riding the dragon kind of thing, literally. So the awakening of Kundalini here was for that very sake. We can dive into the specifics of that as a separate topic. Whereas Shaivites in Tantric Śaivism, this is a scholarly term for Kashmir Shaivism, the goal was, in my understanding, more noble and more novel. It was not about the powers that are often accompanied or associated with the process of awakening itself, but rather to go to that what gives access only through the awakened Kundalini in terms of surrender, progressive surrender, until the power of the goddess, and of course we will lose a lot of people out there in the audience if we don't define and speak about what goddess here represents, because in our day and age it can be so misunderstood, right? In our day and age of that, let's say, post-industrial revolution way of how we speak about these powers, right? in completely and utterly demythologized society and culture, right, where also prolonged phase of Abrahamic religions left very, very strong imprint on how we relate and understand what goddess means and what goddess doesn't. So, but leaving that aside now, the goal of the Shaivites was to be possessed by the goddess. You see? When the goddess takes possession, and in giving oneself to the power of the goddess, one begins to embody the goddess, which one already is an expression of. And that what gives, effectively speaking, this perhaps that's where the territory, we could say or argue, shared with some of the loftiest aspirations of the great yogis, and not particularly that not yogi tradition of the nuts, right? All those like matted locks, and those who disregard all societal rules, they walk out on life. These are not even swamis. These are not even your kind of average sannyasins. These are like, they are different sects. They're different, let's say, there are more extreme ones, but they live in the freedom of consciousness, we could say, right? They live in that total freedom. They break all the boundaries, the societal boundaries to begin with, meant to be broken right there and then. So that where the shared territory perhaps is there, so that one can enjoy the very, very essence of what human here, life and human being represents, what actually available to a human being due to the unique structure of nervous system. So this, putting a pause here and going back to where you were constructing your question, I detect there that, yes, a lot of people out there experience this symptomatology. And this is why in the book also importance was given to separate wheat from the chaff. And we've introduced a very important term in Sanskrit known as Pranothana. And that term stands for that, what effectively speaking is an heightened pranic activity. But it is not Kundalini awakening. And it is so easy to mistake this and confuse the two, because Pranothana displays, or rather the human being undergoes very similar outwardly and inwardly symptomatology as in the case of a true Kundalini process. It's almost identical. But that term Pranothana here is important, and it exists in the tradition because it distinguishes Kundalini from Pranothana in one crucial aspect. Pranothana does not alter the sense of identity. So in other words, it does not alter individual at the root. And that is at once not quite there, pity, but safer, you see? But you can ride it. Whereas Kundalini is unpredictable, volatile, and as I said, again, I do hope we can touch on this because it's important so that people stop kind of, there's a proliferation of all this, I will awaken my Kundalini. There is so much spoken these days about very, very irresponsible attitudes, and from Kundalini is the utmost intelligence, so as long as she's awakened, then she knows what to do and everything will be fine. This is a total baloney, irresponsible pronouncements, because that's not the case. Many years ago, as many as 15 years ago, I coined the term in California, expression rather, Kundalini takes no prisoners. What it means is that from the point of view of consciousness, there is no, as it were, investment on the part of that power, whether this body survives or not. You need to understand this. So in other words, this is what distinguishes these two processes. Pranothana, we could speak of as most sophisticated to known to us therapeutic processes out there, full stop. I lay my name on it. I don't know, like, I'm not going as far as to say, like, you know, here is my left hand, cut it off if I'm wrong. But I'm saying this with full understanding of knowing how many methodologies and therapies out there, particularly in that field where the trauma dominates discussion, when all this, let's say, shadow work, all this sort of like work with archetypes, when it comes to shaking the body of the accumulated stresses, including deep-seated traumas, nothing comes close to Pranothana. The work of Peter Levin utilizes this, but clinically and artificially. People undergo shaking because certain electrical impulses run through them. He understands shaking itself is extremely profoundly healing. Shaking, you know, like shaking, like this is why, you know, like why we like dancing, why dancing is liberating, because the body moves, you know, body is in this, like out of its, let's say, rudimentary grid-like movements. Grid-like. Lay down, sit down, lay, you know, up, eating, like, you see what I mean? So yes, this Edo portal, yeah, there's this, like, there's like movers and shakers out there today, right? Breaking back to the animal movements and all the rest of it. All this is fine. It's all good. But the body shakes when it's shaked by the movement of prana. It shakes the way that it cannot be simulated in any other way. Why? Because that's the body responds to the movement of internal, let's say, flow of prana in response to what needs to be done. Because there is already this, we could speak of, deeply programmed within our nervous system, constant propensity to, literally now, pun is intended, to shake off any experience. And we can replace this shake off in terms of not shaking it off as undusting ourselves, right? Kind of shaking off as that poodle who went into the river pond, right?
Yeah.
You know, not quite shaking off, yes, exactly. But in terms of metabolizing unprocessed impressions, metabolizing unprocessed experiences. So this is why the body begins to vibrate, move, shake, scream, cry, laugh, and you know, unstoppably without any cause, without any rational explanation. So the Pranothana, therefore, is the best therapeutic application. Not application is even the wrong term. Event. And so the difference between Pranothana and Kundalini is that Kundalini alters the sense of self.
Well, experientially, from your personal experience or from experience of people that you've taught, is there the experience with Pranothana as it arising from within versus Kundalini, the experientially is like a force that that feels as though it's coming from the outside of the physical body? I only ask because I think I have two distinct experiences somatically. One of the shaking or, you know, the kind of like catharsis. And then there's this other thing that happens where this force seems to physically move my body from, and I can tell that it's not me. It's coming from outside. It's not me. It's like a force that pulls me in different directions, and the degree to which I can surrender to that is the degree to which it can fully express whatever, you know, whatever the expression is. Would that be a way to distinguish the two?
The answer is no. And not to get disappointed. The answer is no. Why? Because in both cases, it's indistinguishable. This is what makes it so tricky.
Okay.
Because in both cases, it's prana moves. Because that's Kundalini, although Kundalini is the chief of all pranas, Kundalini will take the pathway of a particular prana in accord to how that prana works. There are many pranas, there are 10 principles, 5 of which are always dealt with and spoken in the curriculum of, let's say, Ayurveda today, or yoga at the deeper end of it. You know, there's prana, apana, vyana, samana, and udana. 5 different pranic currents. All these pranic currents together orchestrate all activity of the body, all the activity. And we could say not just body, but in a holistic way, we never separate body from the mind. So all mental physiological processes are conducted by these 5 pranas, including inhalation, exhalation, swallowing, blinking of an eyes, digestion, assimilation, evacuation. All these processes are governed by all these pranas. Discharge of menstrual blood, birth of the child, all these are carried out by particular qualities of prana. You see, speech is governed by particular quality of prana, which is very important because it is exactly that quality of prana that drives the awakening process. Udana, it's that from the root ud, upward. And that 5th prana, it's like a gift of gods, if you will, gifts of the divine, to us, because all other pranas take care of the necessities, right? Doing the housework, constantly taking care of the business. And then there's this udana. It expresses itself as speech. See? And not just as speech, but more importantly, it's the creativity in us that is governed by that particular prana. So there is, of course, I always speak about the connection between Kundalini, and not just as a clinical process, because it's important to understand that primary quality of consciousness is the creative impulse. So therefore, this is what makes us, let's say, unique in the kingdom of creatures, because we are here to create. And so this is one of the primary, let's say, aspects of consciousness itself. It's this creation. So that's as in the Shaivite speak of this as like a 5 faces of Shiva, or 5 actions, creation, sustenance, dissolution, concealment of its own essence, and grace revealing power. So like spoken as the 5. So going back to this, why some people go through this psychophysiological symptomatology, but then when they refer back, right, then there's nothing fundamentally has changed in terms of their identity. And that is the reason. So the reason here is because in Pranothana, let's put it this way. The ego structure, or the structure behind identity, is not assaulted. You see?
Yes.
Whereas Kundalini is in charge. In fact, I want to maybe bring this important distinction, an additional understanding, that what each and every one of us experience as this uniqueness of being alive, as being so-and-so, is the very, very essence of Kundalini as that contraction in consciousness. So this was an important part in the book, to give back the meaning of Kundalini beyond this, let's say, purely often clinical yogic perspectives, let alone new age kind of everything goes approach and understanding. So it's that curvature in consciousness. Consciousness in the process of self-exploration and expansion, contracts to itself in that what gives rise to this unique experience of being so and so. It's guided by the principle of that individuation, ahamkara in Sanskrit. And so Kundalini checks that. So Kundalini here is in charge. And likewise, only through the awakening of Kundalini, one can forgo the sense of identity that ahamkara represents. So doesn't, like people like Eckhart Tolle, they made names for themselves and launched out many seekers and helped a lot of people. He's a phenomenal teacher, right? Eckhart Tolle is worth his weight in gold for what he's done. However, when it comes to more nuances and deeper understanding, this is where his teaching will not take any more serious advanced aspirant beyond, simply because it just happened to Eckhart. It just happened to him. He is not coming from the tradition where this understanding is. He's not operating with that language. So when he says ego, and ego is the culprit, right? You know, and many other teachers spoke about that, of course. He's not. He's just an example. Drop your ego, you know. You're coming from the ego, like, you know, be egoless. It's not only easier said than done. It's impossible. It's literally an oxymoron. You cannot drop your ego because the very identity here is checked not by individual agency. It's not yours to begin with. That's the proper understanding of one's identity, you see?
Yes.
So this is why any locking of the horns with that is futile, absolutely futile. And trust me, I was in my early 30s and tried it myself. I remember in the ashrams, I remember seeing the guys who would be like washing dishes from 100, 200 people, just belittling themselves to the ground, to nothing, just to get rid of the ego. No, you cannot wash off your ego as you can wash off the grease of the plate. You know, it's like a shadow. It follows you wherever you go.
Well, when you say Kundalini takes no prisoners, I really like the image of that in a full, the full ascent of Kundalini is then, it's the dissolution of the identification of the ego, but still with, it's like a more like awareness that is sort of further out, so that one can see that the identity is actually the exact same thing as what everything else is, or that it's just one sort of pinpoint in you know, an infinite array of pinpoints or pixels, if you were going to say it like that. But is that kind of what you're saying with it takes no prisoners, in the sense that there's a complete, because I'm imagining this complete explosion of like, now I'm no longer, I no longer have an identity, but it's impossible to get rid of the identity. So there's like some kind of koan there, some kind of irony. Like, yeah, can you speak to that?
Yes, no, absolutely. It is a koan-like, and it's a paradox. And it's a great paradox, of course, and this is where it's like a quicksilver, right? If one wants to grab it, it goes between the fingers. And if you create cup-like shape, it just gathers itself in one place. So it's like this analogy with Mercury is very handy, and in fact used a lot. And it's not just analogy, it serves as a metaphor, but there is also alchemical connotations, because it's exactly, you know, through stabilization of Mercury. So this is the deeper dimension of Tantra. We're not going to go there, not just yet, but with regard to that, takes no prisoners, it was to illustrate simply the dramatic aspect of particular awakenings. And speaking of which, we should add immediately as a side note, tradition even speaks of three types of way of how Kundalini can display its power. It's the mild, intermediate, and violent. That's how it's spoken of. So like literally mild, in which that's what it represents. And intermediate is everything in between. The violent, the volatile is when this danger of where one can literally depart, using it attentively, maybe just as a sort of a placeholder or with a parenthesis, when one departs from that sense of identity too soon, whilst there are still processes of realignment taking place, purification and dissolution of all this, what's in Sanskrit known as vikalpas and samskaras. Vikalpas, thought constructs, and samskaras are accumulated impressions. Of course, Indian tradition speaks of this life not as one and only. It speaks of this as, chain of incarnations. So therefore, you often come across of that expression that these samskaras are accumulated from time immemorial. So these are not just the samskaras of one's own, let's say, life at birth. For the modern maybe listener, we could supplement that with the genealogy, that impact of seventh generation, right? That what is passed on through a gene of the mother and father. So where, effectively speaking, this we don't live just our individuality exclusively as our own. That's another one of those modern age myths. It's kind of maybe came into being with the modern culture. There are some conspiratorial even perspectives that this was manufactured because that somehow serves, you see. Whereas the more tribal, certainly more ancient understanding that the human being is never himself as that, let's say, life is concerned. Like he's an embodiment here of a lot of predecessors. So this is why, like in Spain, for to this day, one's name contains many other names of the family members, as you know, right? Like it could father's, mother's side. And it's kind of like may seem anachronistic, but it has that reason as well, because it carries. In Arabic culture, in Arabs, this is the same. Like where I come from, I was born in Uzbekistan and during the time of the Soviet Union. So that tradition is also kept within. I'm not talking about how Soviets approach that. So this, let's say, genealogy or versus more Indian traditional understanding of continued stream of incarnations, each carries certain psychic impressions that are working themselves out in this life. So all this is now being purged out of the system with tremendous force, literally. And so the understanding, of course, of the subtle body in Kashmir Shaivism is unparalleled. It's very close to that what Hatha Yoga Pradipika deals with, except that in my view and in my experience and knowledge, it's more sophisticated in a sense of how it all sits together. You see, in other words, the system somehow which we derived from that, both those aforementioned texts, Shat Chakra Nirupana and Hatha Yoga Pradipika. Somehow, what is adopted into the use in the modern days, in the New Age in particular, is this kind of stripped to nuances system. You have 7 chakras, you have this Ida and Pingala, you have Sushumna in the middle, awakening of taking place down there, you go through all this like an elevator, and then you get enlightened. It all sounds nice and dandy, but that's not really what's taking place.
Where do I sign up, Igor? Where do I sign up for that?
Listen, I'm still trying to figure it out myself, like maybe I missed the boat, but the important thing is that, and the beauty of it, of course, is that, of course, it's one can feel very easy victim to speculations and, but all this kind of like, oh, like, am I afflicted individual if this is not active in me, or this not? Well, this is where we need to separate wheat from the chaff and very clearly understand. And this is where maybe the main emphasis is that it's not a personal affair. This is exactly where our modernity is struggling, because we seem to come from a place wherever we go is to accumulate that into what we have. So it has this kind of like, oh, and this sacred knowledge, I'll take that. Yes, okay, so what are the shortcuts? I understand, guys, you've spent here a few thousand years figuring it out, but if you figured it out, can we do it fast and easy? Can you please? And trust me, I've met people who do exactly that, particularly those who were successful businessmen, successful brokers, successful tradesmen. They were like, when they come to spirituality, they don't want to like, listen, this is going back to the days when I still had private sessions, like, some many years ago. Can we just cut through all this, right? Can cut through the chase, go straight to the, can you tell me how to milk the cow of heaven? Where do I stick my tongue so that like a nectar of immortality flows profusely? So like, can we go straight there? Or how do I awaken how do I awaken the third eye? Like that. So of course, all this is pearls, right, of living in our day and age, right? This explosion of information and its sheer availability, and now with AI, this is like sky's the limit, so it seems. But now going and retracing that let's say more meandering way of responding to that question. So this is very helpful understanding. So if people out there now listening and they've gone through some psychophysiological symptomatology and they feel like, well, why am I not enlightened? Well, that's the answer. Or let's say, where am I? I'm not better off. But then again, I would say, well, maybe you are better off. It depends, of course, how committed, how dedicated, and whether this was totally DIY, or was there some answers seeked for explanation, for guidance, for tweaking. So that Pranothana itself is an extraordinary divine process through and through. Let's not undermine this for a moment. And this is where I hope the conversation at large will unfold, particularly with regard to, let's say, neuroscience, where the neuroscience is today. Because there are lots of attempts to look at these solutions, and everyone, not everyone, this exaggeration, but a lot of people out there kind of saying that we are on the verge of pandemic when it comes to mental illness and all sorts of madness, right? That we literally, we reach the point of no return. And so this is exactly the functioning of Kundalini and the functioning of the heightened pranic activity, because it kicks in when the nervous system has accumulated too much information it can no longer process. And it cannot function. Function in what? And I'm not interested in this dashboard perspectives. I'm wearing a spacesuit kind of approach to the senses, and this is like I'm consciousness navigating this body. This is so retarded and so like passé. I don't even know where it comes from. How can people speak about this divinely orchestrated body as some kind of dashboard, as some kind of, no, that's not, that's where the beauty of Kashmir Shaivism comes in, because it restores this divine essence of human being to where it rightfully belongs, to what human being truly represents. This is a big kick into the groins of big pharma to what human being here truly is. So there is, if there is a future in terms of how we are to ascertain ourselves and prove we are worth of something, and it is through the utilizing these very resources we're born with, not through chemicals. This is why I'm unapologetic when it comes to even consciousness altering substances, because it's still taking something in. Whereas the essence of this work is self-generating. There's nothing. I'm drinking tea here, green tea. The green tea from Japan, it's better than any freaking consciousness altering substance. It's packed with nutrients, and all this I can talk to you guys to sleep about its beauty, but I'm drinking it because I enjoy it, you see? So this is what we're really speaking about here when we're speaking about this. So this at least for me, where you can sense also where the passion here, right? Where this, to me, this is not a cold cut, sort of like clinical affair of dissecting, opening out, and studying some kind of a dead frog. No. And so yes, so something along those lines.
That has me think about this phenomenon I've seen a lot in the practice of circling, which is like an open, emergent, social, meditative practice. And so then we'll spend hours in present moment awareness together. And often you'll see emerge shamanic rituals and a lot of these the symptomatology you're talking about, like people will move into spontaneous like mudras, or like they'll arrange themselves in the room and it'll be like perfectly choreographed ceremonial magic, but just spontaneously. And something that I notice when that happens is that when we go through that, it feels very remarkably, very remarkable. It's just like this incredible enlivening experience, like we're touching on something. But like my friend said, it's kind of like you like pluck a string on a guitar and you're like, wow, that's beautiful. But it's like, well, yeah, you literally just touched the instrument, but there's so much more to go. And so then that has me think about these spontaneous experiences we have with this profound power and the beautiful just technology of our bodies and in space working and bubbling up through consciousness. Like, how do we start to root these things in real practice? Like, where would we begin to sort of move past these little awakenings of like, hey, this stuff is possible? Yeah, I guess I'm curious about rooting that in actual practice, actual mastery of this instrument.
Well, if I hear you, if I hear this correctly, and please elaborate further if I'm taking it elsewhere, that it's already taking place quite, I would say, dramatically and remarkably. This is my experience over the years. And if before it was sort of like you hear, this happening here and there, right? This is becoming more and more and more common, right? Commonplace. This is taking place across the globe. And you rightly pointed out that in these shamanic ceremonies, in this work which invokes, which is a very important term here, invokes certain power, right? This through that process of invocation. Lest we forget that all forms of spirituality, we could argue, have their roots in, or share their roots with what and where shamanic practices themselves come from. Before all the, let's say, religions came to the scene. So that shamanic approach, shamanic practices, this is the most tribal form, the most ancient form of spirituality. Literally. getting to the communion or having the communion with underlying forces of creation. And for our ancestors, again, we can argue this was a matter of survival. This was the matter of simply being alive. This is a matter of negotiating the place in the environment. So in other words, it potentially was a matter of being accepted in a land, be it a desert, a jungle, mountains, cold conditions, hot conditions, whether this is in relation to hunting or agriculture. You see, you are dealing with forces of nature. You are dealing here with elements. You're dealing with seasons, movements of planets. You're dealing with here with literally elements, fire, water, wind, right? All this, easy for us modern people to forget as we relate to this in a complete detached manner of it being just kind of chemical compositions out there, irrespective of how this actually relates to us human beings. But look now what's happening in Europe. Europe is ablaze on fire with these wildfires in places where wildfires haven't been observed for decades. Spain, Portugal, France, Italy, Greece, England, wildfires in England. You see? So what I'm getting at, so this, what I used as a term, negotiating. Negotiating is seeking alignment within these forces of nature, without which there is no way to survive, there is no way to grow crops, there is no way to safely hunt, there is no way to be free of disease. Because we're speaking of the time before, let's say, all this was reevaluated, even the package of this religion, that religion, and then Industrial Revolution came. Well, first Renaissance, and with Renaissance, Industrial Revolution, so-called Age of Enlightenment, Age of Reason. So gradually all this was shutting down. Religion was shutting down. All this, they were deliberately called primitive forms of communion. You need to now worship abstract God somewhere, no one knows where, maybe in heaven. And this plane of earth became place of punishment, of sin, of shame. You have to cultivate land and sweat and, and the labor, and the woman's supposed to give birth in pain. You see, the indoctrination is profound. This indoctrination was to make sure that people become enslaved in their own skin, enslaved in their own consciousness, enslaved by their own consciousness. We know for fact that in golden age of India, birth giving was considered to be the most blissful experience. There are records in the cultures left amongst Native Americans, among Egyptians. The birth giving was not supposed to be seen as a punishment for a woman for tempting men into a gravely, that gravely sin of eating of the, from the tree of knowledge. Okay, this is now we're departing and going somewhere else, but it is connecting to this, what Jonathan, you just touched upon, these forms of shamanic spirituality, right? Where this most primitive, and unless we rehabilitate the term primitive, unless we view primitive as sophisticated, and I can tell you, as having the background in arts, when you speak of primitive, you don't actually mean as not sophisticated. The term primitive, when it comes to usage in the work of in the art history, is very different from how it is used by lay people. You have primitive, let's say, way of how certain tribes performed certain rituals, songs, dances, certain objects were made. but there's a high sophistication behind it. See? There is intricacy in that. And so it's not about, oh, Michelangelo can make Sistine Chapel look like a real, real people there on the ceiling or on the wall, right? Everything looks like a. It's not about imitating nature, look nature-like. The archaic Greece, right? By far much more powerful in terms of its visual expression, where you feel the spirit emanating from a carved block of marble, then later Hellenistic work where people's bodies look as if plaster cast molded out of real life. Just next time you are traveling, or just Google and look for yourself, those kouros and kouroses of the archaic Greece, those freestanding female and male sculptures. And look at how much spirit, how much presence they emanate in that seeming stillness, almost stiffness of the posture. And then you go straight into this classical and post-classical period in ancient Greece. Right? You go all the way to Hellenistic period, where you have all this Laocoon, wrestling with the serpents. You have all this, gods and goddesses. All of them are looking so like the marble looks almost like a flesh. See? Where is spirit in that? That tension between spirit and matter, that tension between form and essence is broken. The form begins to dominate. So this is where we live in the society. That echo of that break, of that departure, was already lamented by Nietzsche in the 19th century. That the Western civilization took the wrong turn, the wrong trajectory. At the time, it felt like that. Just an inch, just an iota. But as the centuries progressed, God knows where we are right now. Certainly, we could say, if we apply this logic, if we apply this understanding of that balance that needs to be maintained between the essence and the form, we are now in time when the form utterly and entirely usurps the essence, dominating the essence. And with AI, that comes to a complete and utter calcification, almost like a tomb onto the life of a being, you see?
I heard you refer earlier in the conversation to the potential for, especially with, say, a violent Kundalini or even intermediate, that there's almost a danger of, maybe physical injury, but certainly potentially psychological injury. But it's almost down, like Kundalini, I'm imagining now, I'm seeing as this, it's like a natural thing that is just always, that's just always occurring, and that there's this cultural, maybe it's modernity, whatever, in what you've been speaking to these last few minutes, that places this object in the way of that natural expression having its way, like, and that the danger is almost the identification of the separate self is the danger, is the thing that's getting in the way of Kundalini having, like, it wouldn't need to take a prisoner if I wasn't a prisoner to be taken,
Yeah.
like,
yes, totally. I don't know if I hear you again, but this exactly. You're really the crux of the matter. It's this is why. And by the way, this also kind of like answering still further to what Jonathan posed there, because I didn't quite manage to. But this is very clearly here. We could observe this, how our culture, our current civilization and consensus has arrived to this utter and entire calcification of that individuation, to the point of what I now speak of as like about the tomb to be closed. And that's why it's becoming so commonplace. So it's not, in other words, consciousness now vibrates because that not to happen. So this why we have this, let's say, people speak of awakening. I would say definitely mass activation. There's a definitely revelation is going on. There's a definitely alignment, realignment is going on. Just as there is increase in, let's say, negativity, that is also by virtue of that very same polarization is part and parcel of the process. We observe all that, but all that was sitting there neatly swept under the rug anyway. So we are becoming in the possession of all this information alone, including in how the history itself, indoctrination, the politics, the economics, all this is together. All this is inseparable from the vibration of consciousness. We cannot view this as a exclusively only in this area, and then somehow all these perturbations, all these disasters, natural, man-made, all this is taking place independently from our consciousness. We cannot. If we are to speak from the place of consciousness platform, then we will commit a terrible blasphemy or error if we separate this. This is why in my work, there is no such thing as, my spiritual work, my existential well-being, and the rest is like, let the world drown or something, because it's an illusion. That's a very, very, that's a very bankrupt way of looking. So yes, I would say definitely there is something to that there is this activation on the rise, and simply because that's within the consciousness, certain, let's say, ideas, ideologies, expressions exercise themselves, because also in the field of pure potentialities, everything is possible. That's how consciousness expresses itself. And we here, as the guardians of that, as custodians, as guardians, exercise these rights. It is through us. Yes, dolphins are definitely intelligent creatures, but did dolphins build civilization? Do they have cities under this, somewhere in the oceans? No, I haven't come across. Whatever, orcas, whales, they're all intelligent. But did they actually depart from their natural way of habitat and life and start creating something? No. That primate, did primates do that? Did any other creatures? No. But only us humans. See? So this is laying aside all these arguments about, what makes you think we're so important, It's like, no, of course we are not the only intelligent creatures. There's intelligence at every level displays itself. In stone, it's so inert. We don't know. We have to wait another 1,000,000 years before that stone will display something. And then it might decide not to for another 10 million years. Right? But we know that the frog is very intelligent. We know the rat is very intelligent. We know the cat is very intelligent. We know the cow is extraordinary. So of course, but none of these animals or creatures out there create other than what they are. They live in their habitat environment. We take them into our habitat. We domesticate them, and they become part and parcel of our game. So this is where that field of pure potentiality is exercised in you and me. You see, nowhere else. I don't see where else is it exercised. So perhaps some kind of ideologies, ideas, dreams, aspirations, intentions that have been held collectively, cherished and nourished, outlive themselves, and they're simply a waste, mental waste. And what's really, of course, contemptible is that some of the most wealthiest people out there today, right, they still latch on this mental waste, going to Mars, going this, this, it's almost like playing different games with now real toys rather than imaginative toys, you know. But it doesn't show any level of growing out of the adolescent phase that you know some of these men play, you know. So I'm just giving it as an example, maybe as a kind of a more expansive reflection to where we are in with regard to this, right? How all this is afflicted by virtue of all is possible with our consciousness. Everything is possible. We can create hell. We can create heaven. We literally, it's at the tip of our fingers, because that's what the essence of human being is. That's the, you know, God created this and then delegated that to Adam and Eve, right? Adam here as it's the whole point is that it's that understanding of responsibility in the garden of creation lays upon human being by virtue of human being capacity to carry that through the field and influence the field with that. That's what nervous system is. That's the marvel of the nervous system.
Notice in a lot of personal experiences with Kundalini awakening, it seems to require, or it is quickened by extraordinary trauma or shocks to the system that then lead to the crack that allows in this greater awakening. And so then I'm sitting with living in a time where our culture has brought this choice of form over essence to such extraordinary extreme levels, and that we're experiencing really extraordinary feedback from from nature and from each other. It's like, are we coming to a trauma point that then is the liberation from that, you know, the original sin of like Western civilization? I don't know. That's, yeah, as I'm listening to you, I'm filled with, I don't know if it's just cope or if it's yeah, if it's real optimism.
Well, we should not forget that the understanding of Kundalini, where it comes from, was dealing with this already 1,000 years ago, and before that, with that very, very, let's say, dichotomy and that principle. So what we call today trauma is where somehow, to put it plainly, life is given a waste because it's not extracting what life is here for. So in other words, that juice, that essence of what life here affords cannot be wasted. And that's the alchemy, that's the inner alchemy of all the yogas, is to restore that so that one can partake in that what truly is fulfilling, other than a constant consolation for the lack of that fulfillment. So therefore it is a cultural, I would say, prerogative, civilizational perspective. So it's not just the West did something wrong and now convulsing in, and then through the necessity to reevaluate itself in this awakening, let's say, spasms, right? No, that is very clearly understood already in the ancient world, and it clearly understood in ancient civilization, that this line always need to be walked. It's a graceful walk, and it constantly requires that. One can always veer off. So, and this is where that the beauty of this is, that what Kundalini here truly represents, and what the life truly represents here, is a reflection of one another. So Kundalini is what gives rise to this usurped, pocketed experience of being so and so. So in other words, that glorious experience already of being alive as an individual is a gift. But if that gift is not reconciled, if the affair is not set straight, if it is not given back, sooner or later suffering kicks in. You see? So the Shaivites gave different perspective. Buddha's teaching was unapologetically, we are done, like done. Sukha dukkha. Every experience in the end is suffering, right? So sukha, enjoyment, pleasure, dukkha, suffering. So everything at the end of it is suffering. That's, at least that's the one of the basic tenets upon which Buddhism is found in its manifold form. Today, up to today. The Shaivite's perspective is different, you see? Experience itself is not to be blamed. In fact, in the experience you need to be able to find, locate that. And that's why the doctrines and the philosophy here is life affirming, not life denying. The beauty of this philosophy is that it's in its life affirming qualities. So it's not some other life. So it's not otherworldly life. It's this worldly life. But of course, this worldly life is required to be aligned because it constantly goes out of whack by design, because this is where awareness conceals itself. And so it needs to undergo that self-revelation. So the suffering kicks in as a reminder in our day and nature. It kicks in soon as that, let's say we speculate, what if in someone this is not usurped? One doesn't leave the burden of that individuation. Then I would argue then there is that's it. You see that there's no need for anything. No need for code of conduct, no need for do's and don'ts, no need for spiritual practices, no need for religion. It's like a John Lennon song, Imagine, right? Remember that? Imagine, like the great, yeah, exactly. It's like, so that if this is the case, then of course, like, there's no need for any awakening, for anything. There's nothing to align. But we know that's not the case. We know this is a price we pay on a daily basis. This is the price, Someone did something, someone said the wrong thing to us, and our peace is destroyed. We hear something and like nearest and dearest trigger us in manifold ways. We cannot even have a constructive way to go about this. See? So this is like this, we can't lie to ourselves. And so therefore this somehow is checked by some power, something goes from behind. And in Tantra, that understanding is very clear. You see, it's all the schools of psychology incorporated that. Carl Jung did a service by infusing his work, infusing his understanding with Tantric teaching. He gave his seminars on Kundalini in the 30s in Zurich in 1933, I think, or something like that. It was like that historical time, maybe más o menos around that time. So like this, already his seminars on Kundalini, which he drew richly from all that what was available around that time to the intellectuals of Europe, to the educated, the translated works. And so, of course, his psychology is therefore much richer than his predecessor, Sigmund Freud, which could be seen as very, very primitive. And in this sense, is that applying that term truly in that the diminutive way. So this understanding of the human being in terms of all that Freud was freely operating with, drawing all richly from all the texts and whatever was available to him, and he developed his own system. Of course, there are critical assessments have been done along with appraisal and acknowledgement. He also misunderstood the main value of Kundalini, that it is consciousness itself. It's no, because he just molded it into to suit his own system of, that his consciousness-based model, conscious and subconscious and unconscious, that Kundalini here represents the sum total of it. Okay? It's like, speaking of truly integral way of understanding, is that term in integral philosophy of Sri Aurobindo, supraconscious. So it's not that what is subject to coming and going, waking, dreaming, deep sleep, states of consciousness, right? Waking, that's what is characterized by us sharing this, right? When we awake, senses, the mind, all this in sync, right? Dreaming state, which corresponds to the subconscious realm, right? The realm of the astral, and therefore has completely the laws of nature don't touch it, because it's not physical realm. And then the unconscious, the causal realm, the realm of deep sleep, where we all rest from the notion of individuality on a daily basis. So, not sure where we're going now, but where we're going with this. But as I said this at the beginning, this theme is so very intricate and all-encompassing. So we can take any stab at it at any point, and it will take us. You see, it will take us to its very heart. Doesn't matter what periphery we approach from.
Yeah, I'm here at the end of our time. I think I'm walking away with this sense of Kundalini as such an infinite way to contemplate experience. It's this lens that it seems to be so deeply productive as if we look through it. And I want to thank you for coming on to the container. And I'm told that this is, dude, this book, it's truly a beautiful book, but also the content is so exhaustive, and we've been just enjoying it, tearing it up, going through it here at the station. So so if you're interested in more of Igor Kufayev's work, then we'll have links in the show notes to his website and to where you can get his book from Song Publishing, which I believe is a project of yours, correct?
Yes, it's our own publishing house. We started in 2023. So this is a second book, and the first was just a foot through the door, very slim, Camatkāra, The Hidden Path, which was kind of paying tribute to my background and the years as an artist, young years as an artist. So it kind of served as a bridge, and with, again, under the umbrella of that beautiful philosophy of the Shaivites, right? So that Camatkāra, this debut book, is translated as astonishment or wonder.
Igor, thank you again so much for talking with us and coming on to the container.